Good to see all of you again. We approach the end of the semester, and we are currently at the tail end of chapter 14, and we're going to dispense with what's left of that chapter very quickly and move over into chapter 15, where we will stay for a while. We've gotten to the juncture where the event that we have been building toward over several lectures and over several decades, the breakup of the Union, is now at hand. We've seen crisis after crisis sweep across the country. We have seen compromises and strong actions by important political characters like Henry Clay, Stephen Douglas, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, hold the Union together. But each time the country found itself in one of these crises, solving it had been harder to do, the compromise had been more difficult to construct, and the bad blood left over from those events had lingered. There was a lot of water, in other words, that has run under the bridge now, and it has sown distrust and resentment and anger, and we have seen that begin to percolate to the surface in Bleeding Kansas. We have seen it in the anger that has come out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That law passed by Stephen Douglas has fatally split the Whig Party and killed it off. It has produced the Republican Party, which is dedicated to overturning Kansas-Nebraska and restoring the old 36-30 line that forbids slavery in the northern reaches of Louisiana Purchase. And the Republican Party, of course, is also dedicated to containing the spread of slavery. There are some Republicans who argue that slavery should be attacked and done away with, but most Republicans understand the difficulties of getting rid of the institution, understand that it is constitutional and it cannot really be touched in the states where it exists, but they believe that it is within the purview of the federal government to prevent slavery from spreading. All of this, of course, is seen as a threat by Southern politicians who fear that the long-dreaded moment when the North is going to become not just demographically dominant in the country and therefore the controlling player in the House of Representatives, but it's about to become the dominant factor in the Senate and the presidency, and from there the courts as well. Southern political power appears to be waning. The South's hold on the Democratic Party, of course, tenuous, especially after Kansas-Nebraska, which divided the Democrats between northern and southern wings over the theories that Stephen Douglas had advanced to get Kansas-Nebraska passed, and then the theories that he had used to claim in the Senate election of 1858 during those famous debates with Abraham Lincoln that he hadn't really given the South anything that was worth having, since slavery was never going to go into a region like the Great Plains. And also, Douglas had been maneuvered into saying by Lincoln that it was possible to exclude slavery from a territory because territorial legislatures could do it, and therefore Southerners who believed that repealing 3630 had opened vast reaches of the West to slavery found out that that was not what Douglas believed at all. And then you have the Dred Scott case come in, and the Dred Scott case basically says that even in free states, a slaveholder could take his slave, keep his slave, use his slave there, which calls into question the whole concept. Can there be free states? Can there be slave states? And it led a lot of angry Northerners to claim that Southerners would not be happy until there were no free states, that everything would be slave states. This had produced a brilliant speech by Abraham Lincoln in which he brought up this dilemma and basically says that the Union is going to have to become one thing or the other. It cannot remain, as he says, permanently half free and half slave. It's going to have to be one or the other, and then issues a sort of dark warning that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And whereas Lincoln says he does not expect the house to fall, he does expect the house to no longer be divided. This coming in the aftermath of his famous debates with Douglas, of course, brought him even greater prominence and made him an attractive candidate for the Republican Party when we come into the election of 1860, an election, remember, that's taking place just a little bit more than a year after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And this attempt to start a slave insurrection by attacking and seizing the United States arsenal had sent a shudder of horror throughout the South, and whereas most Northerners were appalled by it as well, we must remember that in the New England states, John Brown was seen as a martyr to the great cause of abolition, and he was mourned when he was hung. And to a lot of Southerners, this seemed to indicate how far the North was willing to go in order to destroy slavery. And of course, slavery, in many ways, is the key issue here, and in some ways it's not. And we have to remember that no one alive in the 1850s, the 1860s, had created the institution of slavery. Slavery is one of the oldest of all human institutions. It had always existed, and it was brought to the Western Hemisphere by the Spanish, the Portuguese, by the Dutch, and by the British. It was woven into the fabric of the 13 colonies. Every colony had slavery. That had not begun to change until the Declaration of Independence. Slavery had been done away with where it was least important economically, and it had held on where it was economically vital in the growing of cash crops. And although for a time the decline into the importance of tobacco had made it look like slavery might die out, and that had helped to produce things like the American Colonization Society, Eli Whitney's cotton gin had given new lease to slavery by making cotton king in the South, as it was often called, and had made slavery economically more important to the South than ever before. Slavery is therefore an economic question, and being an economic question, it also becomes therefore a political question. It is the basis of Southern economic power, and therefore it's the basis of Southern political power as well, which gives the South the ability to push the policies and the interpretation of the Constitution that it prefers in the national government. And although Southerners make up a minority of the American population, they do make up the majority of the membership in the Democratic Party. So by controlling the dominant party, the Democrats, the Southerners in some way were able to control the national government, much to the irritation and resentment of Northerners. We'd first seen that manifest itself back in the Missouri crisis of 1820. We'd seen it manifest itself again in the lead up to the Mexican War. We'd seen it manifest itself yet again in the crisis of 1850. And so slavery is sort of the binding glue that makes economic issues and political issues and cultural issues and constitutional issues all stick together in a way that it's impossible to resolve them peacefully, and it's become increasingly evident. And remember that slavery is something in which both North and South benefit. Slavery keeps blacks in the South, which is where Northerners prefer them to be. If you were to get rid of slavery, a lot of Northerners are afraid that the free blacks will flood into the North. They'll depress wages because they'll be willing to work for next to nothing, and that would be detrimental to Northern laborers who already believe that they're not being treated particularly well, that they're not benefiting from their labor as much as they should. Remember that Northerners and Southerners view African Americans in the same way, which by today's standards would be wildly racist. Even Lincoln, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, admits that the two races are not equal and that the white race is superior and ought to remain superior, even though he does not believe necessarily that blacks should be slaves. And he does believe, as do most Northerners, that they should not be jurors, they should not be soldiers, they should not be elected to office, these sorts of things. The North benefits economically from slavery as much as the South, because the South is growing all that cotton. That cotton is being hauled to foreign ports in northern ships by northern shippers, by northern sailors. Some of that cotton is going into northern mills where it's fed into the power looms. Southerners buy with cotton profits manufactured goods from the North, and also a lot of manufactured goods from Europe and especially England. Those goods are of course taxed when they come into the U.S. ports. And the principal way that the United States government raised revenue was with a tariff. There was no income tax of any kind, and so the tariff was the backbone of funding the government. And most of that money is brought in by the importation of goods that are purchased with the profits of Southern cotton. And so everything is really kind of woven together in a way that makes it hard to separate. The only people who are really seeing slavery as a moral issue are the radical abolitionists. Remember, they're a minority, and although Northerners are increasingly sympathetic with the idea that slavery is wicked and evil, they have not lost sight of the complications of doing away with slavery. Where would the slaves go? How would they live? Where would they work? How would they keep a roof over their head? Those are practical, everyday issues. And what would happen to the wealth of the South, the productivity of the South? What second and third and fourth level effects would that breed? And the idea of the radical abolitionists that none of that is as important as getting rid of slavery. You have to end the evil first and then figure out the solutions to these other problems. Most Northerners see that as really impracticable. And they also believe that the slavery is the South's thing. Let the South alone. We might not agree with it. We might not like it. But we don't really want to go there and disrupt it. That's a little bit harder stance to take thanks to the Fugitive Slave Act and after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, perhaps. But it's still the majority position of most Northerners. And so you're in a very complex environment. You've got radical abolitionists pushing in one direction. You've got Southern fire eaters who are politicians who believe that it is impossible now for the South to get a fair shake of the Union, that the central government has already gained too much power, that the Northern influence is corrupting the Constitution, and the time has come for the South to separate while she still can, while she has the strength to do so. They're pushing in another direction, and in the midst of all of this swirling around, we have the election of 1860. And it is an election in which the Republican Party is going to run a candidate for the presidency for only the second time. Remember, the Republicans, born in the immediate aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, have run a candidate for the White House in 1856. Charles C. Fremont, he had lost because he'd been too radical on the slavery question, and also because the Republican Party had been too new. The Democrats had managed to hold together and elect James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, was sort of seen as a non-controversial candidate, but he had proven unable to really get a grip on the problems that are now battering the country ever more rapidly. And Buchanan, therefore, is not going to be anybody's nominee in the election of 1860. And the Democrats, who are still the majority party, go into the election of 1860 split. Stephen Douglas is the preferred candidate of his northern wings, but he is utterly unacceptable to the southern wing, and that gives the young Republican Party a chance. There's an axiom in American politics that has really never failed to work, particularly on a national scale, and that is if one major party splits, the other major party is going to win. So Republican unity versus Democratic division does not bode well for a Democratic victory, and Democratic defeat does not bode well for holding the Union together. So the Republicans held their convention in Chicago, Illinois. Of course, Illinois is Lincoln's home state, so that is somewhat beneficial to him. It was easy for his campaign managers to get a lot of his supporters there, where they were very vocal for their guy. The interesting thing about Lincoln is, though he had become prominent in Republican circles, he was a well-known name. He was not dominant in Republican circles. There were Eastern candidates like Seward, for example, who had much greater recognition and looked like they might be able to snag the nomination. But Seward and most of these other top-tier candidates had been too radical on the slave question in past years, and that made their electability dubious. Lincoln was nobody's first choice for the Republican nomination, but he was everybody's second choice. And when the top-tier candidates, one by one, were unable to gather enough votes to grab the nomination, their supporters began to peel off and drift toward Lincoln. And finally, on the third go-round, on the third ballot, Lincoln got the nomination. And so Abraham Lincoln of Illinois is going to be the Republican candidate in 1860. And he's going to run against, in fact, two Democratic candidates. And what the Democrats did is they held their convention in Charleston, South Carolina in April of 1860. And of course, the choice here was not good for the supporters of Stephen Douglas. And Charleston is the most radical city in the most radical state of the South. And there are Southern fighting politicians who come to Charleston determined that Stephen Douglas will not be the candidate of the Democratic Party, and they understand that if he does not become the candidate, that means that the Democratic Party is going to split. A split Democratic Party is going to mean a Republican victory, and they are willing to see that happen if this is what allows Southerners to finally realize that the old Union is now a threat to their way of life, to their prosperity, to their social stability, to their economic power, and that they had better get out of the Union while they still can. So what happens in Charleston is that Douglas is unable to gather enough delegates to get the nomination. The Southern delegates walk out. That leads to the convention adjourning and agreeing to come back together in a couple of months in Baltimore in June of 1860, but when they reconvene in Baltimore, another Southern city with strong Southern sympathies, Douglas does really know better. The Southern delegates walk out again, and now the Democratic Party is officially split. And so the northern wing of that party nominates Stephen Douglas. The southern wing nominates John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the current vice president, as their candidate. And so you have three candidates now: Lincoln the Republican, Douglas the Northern Democrat, Breckinridge the Southern Democrat, and everybody sees the handwriting on the wall. What that means, if Lincoln's opposition is split, the Democrats are going to lose, Lincoln is going to win, and the election of a Republican, which will happen almost entirely with Northern votes, is probably going to lead to the secession of the slave states of the Deep South at the very least. Seeing this handwriting on the wall, there was a desperate attempt by some men to field a compromise candidate who might prevail over both Republican and Democrats. So you had the formation of something called the Constitutional Union Party. They nominated John Bell from Tennessee, and his platform was basically, if you love the Union, vote for me, because if you vote for anybody else, the Union is going to break apart. That didn't work. There was too much party loyalty. There was too much loyalty to individual candidates, and Bell, being from Tennessee, tended to draw votes from the Democratic candidates, certainly did not draw them from the Republican camp, and as a consequence of that, he almost is a third split in the Democratic Party. The election is held on November 6th of 1860. 1860, and Lincoln wins. In the electoral vote, he wins. He is the beneficiary of his opponents being split. That allows him to grab 4 key swing states to get 180 electoral votes. His opponents put together only got 123 electoral votes. And so Lincoln wins the Electoral College rather handily. He got 54% of the popular vote in the North, but he only got 40% of the national vote. So 60% of the American people voted against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. They did not want him to become the president of the United States. And in fact, in the states of the Deep South, Lincoln got no popular votes at all because he wasn't even on the ballot. There was no Republican Party to put him on the ballot in the Deep South. And so Lincoln is a minority president. More people voted against him than voted for him, but he won the Electoral College and won it fairly handily. And so he is going to be the next president of the United States. And what everybody had feared would happen when that takes place happens before Lincoln is inaugurated. The inauguration, remember, is not going to be until March of 1861, and despite the fact that Lincoln kept making moderate noises about having no intention to interfere in slavery in the states where it then was, Southerners looked at that as a hollow promise. If slavery could not grow into the territory, Southerners were being denied their constitutional rights, they were being denied economic activity, they were being treated unfairly, and containing slavery was merely a way to consign it to a slow instead of a rapid death, which of course is something that the Republicans have in the back of their minds. And so in December of 1860, South Carolina convenes a convention and secedes from the Union. So the thing has finally happened. This threat that had first been made by the Federalists during the War of 1812 at the Hartford Convention to leave the Union, that had been made by Southerners in the Missouri crisis, in the nullification crisis, and the crisis of 1850, has now become fact. Nullification had been attempted and had failed in the 1830s. Will secession, now being attempted, actually work in 1860? Well, one of the things that, of course, had happened to the nullification advocates in the 1830s is that South Carolina had stood alone. Well, in 1860, South Carolina is not going to stand alone, and within a very short period of time, other slave states in the Deep South followed her out of the Union. Florida goes out, Georgia goes out, Alabama goes out, Mississippi goes out, Louisiana goes out, and finally Texas leaves the Union in February of 1861. They all send delegates to Montgomery, Alabama, where there is a constitutional convention that creates a new government, the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy adopts basically a carbon copy of the U.S. Constitution with a couple of minor changes. One of those is the president gets a 6-year term but can't be reelected. The president gets a line item veto. All legislation must focus on a single topic whose purpose should be announced in the title of the legislation, so you can't have something like the omnibus bill and it can be voted on up and down. The right of the states to secede is not mentioned, but it's considered a given that they can do that if they want. But otherwise, the Confederate Constitution is very much like the U.S. Constitution. The Southerners had no beef with the U.S. Constitution. They simply believed that the way that the national government had been manipulating the Constitution, had been ignoring the Constitution, had corrupted the real Constitution. Southerners are claiming the right of rebellion that Thomas Jefferson speaks about in the Declaration of Independence. When people feel that they are misgoverned, they have the right to rebel and to create a new government. Northerners would argue that the Southerners do not have justification for rebellion, but of course the English would have said the same thing in 1776. And so Southerners believe that what they are doing is moral and justifiable, and they also believe it's constitutional within the United States framework. They point to the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. It says all powers not denied to the states in the Constitution are reserved to the federal government. In the Constitution are powers maintained by the states or the people. And since nullification and secession are not powers mentioned in the Constitution, then Southerners argue they are powers retained by the people or by the states, and therefore that secession is perfectly constitutional. And so the Confederacy has been formed. It elects Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as its president, and Alexander Stephens of Georgia as its vice president. Jefferson Davis, of course, was an extremely distinguished figure. He had been a congressman, he had been a senator, he had been a secretary of war under Franklin Pierce. He was one of the heroes of the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican War, where he had been wounded. Davis, like a lot of Southern members of the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate, had decried secession. They had not wanted to see secession. They had felt that secession was a right that the South had, but questioned whether now was the time, that this was the justification. They were reluctant secessionists, but once their states voted to leave the Union, they felt duty-bound to follow the will of their state. And the state came before the Union, just like the old anti-federalist had claimed that the states came before the Union, and that the liberties of the people were best secured by a relatively weak central government. Now they are actually acting on that. And as the Southern states left the Union, they seized peacefully and without any real resistance federal property. So post offices, mints, certain revenue cutters, customs houses, forts, military installations scattered throughout the South. And they claim these as their right because they had been purchased and maintained with tax dollars that were drawn from the entire nation, and therefore they were simply taking their fair share of it. Secession was greeted enthusiastically by the overwhelming majority of Southerners, and it plunged the whole country into unknown territory. This had never been done. It had been talked about many times, but it had never happened. Did Southern states have the right to leave? Did the United States government intend to try and keep them from leaving? And if it did, how would it try to do that? President Buchanan believed that secession was unconstitutional, but he also believed that it was unconstitutional for the United States government to use military force to prevent secession. So that kind of leaves him powerless to do anything about this thing that he thinks cannot possibly be constitutional or constitutionally legal. And some Northerners looked upon Southern secession and were appalled by it and thought that it should be resisted. Other Northerners looked upon it and said, it's unfortunate, but the South wants to go. Then let the South go. Departing sisters err in peace. So you're making a mistake, Southerners, but if you want to go, you'll come back. A great many Northerners, Northern politicians especially in the beginning, believed that this was a giant bluff, that the South didn't mean it. She couldn't be serious. This was a political ploy. This was something that was being done to wring concessions out of the North. And once those concessions had been won, the Southern states would come back. They were going to sort of prove their point. We can do this, but we don't want to, and we'll come back once you give in to us on some things that are important. So it's a great big political ploy, and we just have to play the game out. The radical abolitionists, many of them said, good riddance. We don't want slave states in the Union. We're glad to see you go. But then there's this contradiction. 7 slave states in the Deep South had gone. These are the states along the Gulf Coast. And if you add South Carolina to those states, but 8 slave states in the Upper South had stayed in the Union. These are Virginia and North Carolina, Arkansas and Tennessee, and then you have what are called the border states. These are the slave states immediately adjacent to free states, and that's Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware. And notice that Virginia and Maryland are slave states, and Washington, D.C. is surrounded by them. These states did not leave the Union, and this lent some credence to the idea that what the Deep South was doing was a mere political ploy, and it gave some Northerners, people like Lincoln, hope that this secession business had no real popular support. They pointed to the 8 slave states that were still in and said that slavery is not really the dividing line here. There's still a great deal of Union sentiment in all the seceded states and in the slave states that have not left the Union. And this was really a fundamental misreading of the situation, because the people of the Deep South were in deadly earnest with what they were doing. They really meant it. They intended to create a new nation and to make that new nation work. And they started to build an army, and they began the effort to construct a navy. They believed that they had right on their side with King Cotton, an economic advantage that would help them gain foreign recognition and force the North into concessions. And in the slave states that had not left the Union, pro-Union sentiment was actually very tenuous. It depended on how the United States government reacted, whether or not these states would stay in the Union or eventually leave to join the Confederacy. And all of this, of course, was in many ways theoretical. It was complicated. It was on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Nobody really knew how to react to any of this. Events were moving very swiftly. Northerners loved the Union, believed it was the last best hope of mankind. They didn't want to see the Union come apart, but at the same time, they weren't sure what they could do to keep Southern states in. Is a Union that can only be maintained by war a Union worth having? Remember the problem of the British, the American Revolution. If you have to wage war to make people want to stay, in essence, married to you, you might accomplish that, but will the marriage be worth anything when it is preserved in that way? And so a lot of complexity, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of mixed emotions and feelings, anger, hope, fear, hopefulness, all of it swirling through the country at the same time. And somehow, some way, all that has to get simplified. It has to boil down to something that people can readily understand, something tangible, something that makes the complex simple. And the thing that allowed that to happen in the spring of 1860 was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, Sumter, was named after a Revolutionary War hero. It was built on a man-made island right in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And Fort Sumter, along with nearby Fort Moultrie, which was on the mainland of South Carolina, adjacent to Charleston, were 2 federal installations that had not been gobbled up by the secessionists when South Carolina left the Union. There was a small United States garrison of about 80 men at Fort Moultrie under the command of Kentuckian Major Robert Anderson, and seeing South Carolina secede on December 20th of 1860, Anderson had on Christmas night silently and secretly rowed his men from Fort Moultrie, which was indefensible from land, to Fort Sumter in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And when the South Carolinians and later the Confederate authorities saw what had happened, they were very angry. They had expected Anderson to do what the commanders of other U.S. installations across the country had done, some of them readily, some of them with great reluctance, as happened in Texas, especially along the Rio Grande, where there was, for a time, the real danger that war was going to break out there. this was an affront to the South's nationhood, and Anderson was supposed to have, turned over the keys to Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter and then sailed for home. He had not done that. He believed he was duty-bound not to do it. And so he had taken his troops to Fort Sumter, where the secessionists and the Confederates could not readily get at them, and therefore Fort Sumter becomes the symbol. It becomes the symbol of the question. Is the Union going to fight to preserve its integrity? Is the United States government going to militarily resist secession? Are the Confederates militarily going to insist on secession? And so the new Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, ordered the erection of artillery batteries surrounding Fort Sumter. That job was put under the leadership of a New Orleans native, General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, who ironically had been a student of Anderson's at West Point, where Anderson had taught Beauregard artillery tactics. And so the teacher and the student are now going to face off against each other. And all of this, of course, is taking place in the waning days of the Buchanan administration. And the question that the Buchanan administration, of course, cannot readily cope with is, what should it do? Buchanan, on the one hand, knows that his days in office are numbered. He's on his way out. He does not want to do anything that is going to commit the incoming Lincoln administration irrevocably. He does not want to surrender Fort Sumter, but he does not want to start a war over Fort Sumter. And there's a lot of back-channel talk back and forth about what Buchanan is willing to do or not willing to do, what the incoming Lincoln administration may be willing to do or not willing to do. And all of this is taking place in the backdrop of a logistical crisis at Fort Sumter, because when Anderson went into that island, the South Carolinians had cut off shipments of food to him. So he has a limited amount of rations. He's eating through those daily. If he is not resupplied, he's going to be starved into a surrender, which might be a peaceful end to the crisis, and perhaps one to be preferred even by Anderson, who, like most people, doesn't want to be the guy who pulls the trigger that starts a civil war. But it does mean that time to deal with this is not abundant. You're not going to be able to finesse this for very long. And so Lincoln comes into office in early March of 1861. He is inaugurated. He gives an inaugural address that makes a plea for harmony and unity. He speaks about, the mystic bonds of kinship and the call to union from every patriot, battlefield, and grave. He says Northerners and Southerners can't be enemies. We shouldn't be enemies, that you can't really separate North from South. We were on the same continent. We're going to have to trade with each other. We're going to have to deal with each other one way or the other. And so let us not be enemies. Let us be friends. Let's find a way to get past this. But Lincoln also makes it very clear that he's taken an oath to preserve the Union. That is an oath registered in heaven, as he puts it. And the people who are trying to break up the Union have no similar oath. And so he does not want civil war. He does not expect there to be civil war, but he does expect the Union to be held together, and he's going to do whatever is necessary to hold the Union together. And so this speech is not necessarily one that is going to reconcile the South. The seceded South, at any rate, to Lincoln's presidency. There are all kinds of back channels that are still ongoing. There's a proposal to amend the Constitution, to put a 13th Amendment into the Constitution that would guarantee the existence of slavery in the states where it then was forever. It would be an unamendable amendment. In other words, it couldn't be altered, couldn't be changed, couldn't be removed from the Constitution. In this way, we're going to reassure Southerners that slavery is not going to be attacked by the federal government. Lincoln tentatively threw his support behind that. If that's what would get the South to abandon secession and stay in the Union and get us past this crisis, he was willing to accept that because he believed it was really redundant, that as long as slave states wanted to have slavery, they were constitutionally entitled to do it. The South doesn't doesn't buy off on it because, one, they don't trust the new Lincoln administration, and secondly, as they've always maintained, if slavery cannot grow and expand, slavery cannot survive, that Southerners have the right to take their constitutionally recognized, legally protected property into any territories of the Union. So this isn't really good enough, and so nothing comes of it, but it's indicative of the fact that everybody's trying to find some way to keep this thing from finally really blowing up into civil war. And as Lincoln endeavors to do that, he's shocked to find out something he did not know until he was inaugurated. Major Anderson's almost out of food. That within a handful of weeks, he's going to be starved into surrender, and Fort Sumter is therefore going to be surrendered. And when it's gone, basically the only federal forts still in Confederate territory, save a few of them in the Florida Keys and off the coast of Florida, are going to be abandoned, and that at that point, secession will be a fait accompli, and the ability to test whether or not the Southerners are serious about this is going to be lost forever. And so Lincoln sees Fort Sumter as a way to, in essence, do two things. First, to make a stand, a physical stand. The Union is going to be preserved. We do not accept the fact of secession. We do not accept the constitutionality of secession, and also, in a sense, to call the secessionists bluff. Let's see how serious you really are. So a confrontation at Sumter, Lincoln believes, works in his favor, in the North's favor. Jefferson Davis sees it the same way. He's anxious to prove that the Confederacy is a real going concern, that the secessionists are serious, that they mean it, that this is not a trick. It's not some sort of ploy to win negotiations. We have left the Union. We are no longer part of the Union. We intend to be our own country, just like the 13 colonies had left the British Empire and meant it and intended to be their own nation. He believes a confrontation at Sumter is likely to lead to the secession of the rest of the slave states. And so a confrontation there is going to accrue to the benefit of the Confederacy. And so you have yourself in a situation now where both Lincoln and Davis are willing to push this thing. And so what Lincoln does is decide to send food to Fort Sumter. He decides to send a fleet of 3 ships carrying rations. If Fort Sumter is reprovisioned, Fort Sumter can hold out indefinitely, and the Union flag flying over a fort in the middle of Charleston Harbor will ultimately undermine the entire secessionist project. At least that's what Lincoln believes and what he hopes. So he's going to send ships. And he informs the governor of South Carolina, not Jefferson Davis, because the U.S. government does not recognize the existence, the legitimacy of the Confederate government under Davis. He sends word to the governor of South Carolina that I'm sending food. Those ships will not attempt to land munitions or reinforcements unless they're fired upon. And of course, the governor of South Carolina immediately informs the Davis administration, and the Davis administration knows that the food landing at Sumter means the prolonged ability of the United States to deny the reality and legitimacy of secession, and so Davis is determined that those ships will not land. Buchanan had tried to send ships in January of 1861. They got to the harbor of Charleston. Confederate guns had fired a few shots at them, and they turned around and they'd gone home. Maybe Davis hopes that the same thing is going to happen here, but he's not confident enough in it, and at some point this thing has got to be resolved, and the moment has come to show that secession is real, that the Confederacy is real, that the South means this. And so he sends word to Beauregard to demand Anderson's surrender. And so on April 11th of 1861, Beauregard sends messengers out to Anderson. He says, you need to surrender. If you surrender, you can fire a salute to your flag. You can march off with all your personal equipment, your weapons. We'll give you a ship. We'll send you wherever you want to go. Anderson responds that he is duty-bound not to surrender his post as long as he's able to sustain it. But then he hints to them, if you'll wait 48 hours, I'll be out of food. And when I'm out of food, duty and honor will be satisfied, and I will have to capitulate, and then I will be happy to accept your terms. Of course, what Anderson doesn't know, but Beauregard does, is that those federal ships with supplies are on their way. They'll be off Charleston Harbor the next day or the day after that. And so Beauregard sends word of Anderson's response to Davis. Davis, of course, aware that those supply ships are coming, tells Beauregard, not good enough. He has to surrender now, or you are to open fire. And so once more a message goes to Anderson with that ultimatum. Anderson says he's not able to accept that. And so with much chivalry, great deal of politeness, the way that this was handled, gentleman to gentleman, with all the proper protocols and forms, carefully observed, the Southerners tell Anderson that he has an hour to surrender, and if at the end of that hour he has not given up his post, Confederate batteries are going to open fire. So the hour comes and the hour goes. Anderson, of course, does not haul down his flag. So at 4:30 in the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery on the mainland of South Carolina, ringing Fort Sumter on three sides, opens fire. The first shots that hit Fort Sumter are the beginning of a civil war, although no one is absolutely certain of that fact when it happens, in the same way that the colonists and the English were not certain that Lexington and Concord was the beginning of a war, even though it turns out that it was. Well, the same thing here at Sumter. The bombardment goes on for 36 hours. Fort Sumter is undermanned. It is being pummeled. It is able to fire back only occasionally and not terribly effectively. The citizens of Charleston climb to the rooftops to watch the great bombardment that goes on all through the daylight hours of April 12th and then through the night and on into the next day. And eventually Anderson is basically out of food. His gun positions are being knocked out. The wooden barracks of Fort Sumter have caught on fire. That fire had gotten very close to the powder magazine, which of course if it got there it would ignite it, blow the whole place to smithereens. And so Anderson, having done what his duty required him to do, agrees to surrender. And the bombardment stops after 36 hours. And ironically, this first battle in what will become the bloodiest war in American history. Something like 2% of the American population is going to die in this war. 620,000, maybe as many as 700,000 lives are going to be lost. More Americans will fall on the battlefields and in the hospitals and the camps of our Civil War than in all American wars put together between the Revolution and Vietnam. Not a single person on either side is hurt in the fight at Fort Sumter. Not a person. The Confederates keep their word. Anderson is allowed to depart the fort with arms and equipment and full military honors. He fires a salute to the U.S. flag as it is hauled down. And ironically, during that ceremonial salute, a cannon explodes and 2 men are killed. They become the first casualties in a very bloody war. Anderson and his men are allowed to board the supply ships, which had arrived in the middle of the battle, but of course could not intervene in it, and they are sent home. Anderson is hailed as a great hero, and Fort Sumter has fallen. The flag of the Confederacy now waves over it, and this simplifies everything north and south. The Northerners who had been perplexed and confused about how to deal with this. Is the South, trying to get concessions? Is this a political ploy? Do they mean it? Or are they not serious? Or let them go. We're happy to see them leave. Suddenly, the flag has been fired on. And the fact that the flag has been fired on simplifies the entire thing. And Northerners rally around the president. They rally around the government. The Union must be preserved now. Secession is unconstitutional, is illegal, and secession must be put down. And notice that this war is starting over that question. Slavery and the political and constitutional and economic and cultural tentacles that wrap around slavery and made it this intractable problem. Slavery had helped to produce secession. But what produces the war is secession itself. This conflict begins over a very straightforward and simple question: can a state leave the Union? and the South says it can, and the North says it can't. And that is what this war is going to be about. That is the central theme of the war. What got you to the point of secession is very complex, and slavery has a great deal to do with it. The war does not begin over the question of slavery per se. The North is not launching a crusade to destroy slavery, and although secession is designed to create a Southern republic that will, of course, defend slavery, what the Southerners are willing to fight for is their right to leave the Union. And the U.S. Congress and Lincoln are very clear about this. The U.S. Congress passes a resolution. Lincoln says it all the time. This is a war about preserving the Union. It's not a war about slavery. If we can preserve the Union and we can do it quickly, slavery is going to be left alone. The problems that are involved in getting rid of slavery that had made it hard to do before the war still exist as the war is being fought. We don't want to open that can of worms if we can avoid opening that can of worms. And of course, Lincoln had expected that the Confederates being maneuvered into firing the first shot would therefore be seen as being in the wrong by the world and by the rest of the states. Lincoln was half right. He had hoped that a fight at Sumter would unite the North, and it does. But he had also hoped that a fight at Fort Sumter would convince the 8 slave states that were still in the Union to rally around the national government. And in this, he is wrong, very badly wrong. And Jefferson Davis, who believed that a fight at Fort Sumter would unite the slave states, was mostly but not entirely right. So both presidents have gambled, and they both half won. Lincoln responds to the events at Fort Sumter on April 15th by issuing a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he terms a rebellion, to put down illegal acts that are too widespread for the normal law enforcement activities to suppress. So Lincoln calls for troops, and these troops are going to be raised by the states. There are only 16,000 men in the entire United States Army. Most of them were out west dealing with Indians. And so the U.S. Army is very, very small. You're going to need to raise a volunteer army, just like you've done in the Mexican War and the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. And as was common practice, a quota was sent to every state in the Union. This is how many troops we want you to raise for the new National Volunteer Army. And the 8 slave states still in the Union got those quotas, as well as the free states, and that provoked an immediate response. The slave states that stayed in might not have been willing to leave just on the basis of Lincoln having been elected. Let's wait, let's see what he does, and if he does something that really requires us to take this extreme step. But now he has taken it, that these southern states will not be part of using military force to deny their slave sisters the right to leave the Union. And so in response to Lincoln's call for volunteers, Arkansas and Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee all secede, and they join the Confederacy. And this adds an enormous amount of landmass, an enormous amount of industrial capacity, and an enormous amount of population to the new Confederacy. These borders now stretch from the Potomac all the way to the Rio Grande. So 4 slave states go out. 4 slave states stay in, but they stay in tenuously. Kentucky declares neutrality. It doesn't want to pick sides. It doesn't want to be part of this. And of course, with the border of Kentucky on the Ohio, which is where slavery meets the free Midwest, that makes Kentucky a giant buffer between the North and slave state Virginia and slave state Tennessee. Delaware, a small state, not much of a problem, but Maryland, very, very tricky thing, because Maryland is, of course, the home of the District of Columbia and the national capital, and Maryland's governor and legislature were pro-secession, and Lincoln can't let Maryland leave the Union, and he uses heavy political and military pressure to keep that from happening. In Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, is where some of the first bloodshed of this Civil War happens, when a Massachusetts regiment, the 6th Massachusetts, is marching through the city on its way to Washington, D.C., and a mob of pro-secessionist Baltimore, Maryland citizens attack it. They throw rocks at the soldiers, and then somebody from the crowd fires at them. The soldiers shoot back in return. Citizens are killed, soldiers are killed before the mob is dispersed, and so, as befits a Civil War, the first real bloodshed is soldiers shooting at civilians and civilians shooting at soldiers. And for a time, Washington, D.C. is cut off as Maryland secessionists cut the telegraph lines, they cut the rail lines. It's going to take some weeks for northern troops raised in places like New York and Massachusetts to resurrect those and get to the federal capital. And once that happens, Lincoln moves decisively. He arrests political proponents of secession in Maryland. He keeps the legislature from meeting to vote Maryland out of the Union. He shuts down newspapers. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus, which requires you to be charged with a crime if you're arrested. All of that is put on hold. Lincoln uses a very heavy hand, and in some ways an unconstitutional hand, to hold Maryland into the Union, and he's condemned for it. And the Confederates, of course, point to it and say, yes, this is the kind of tyrant that we refuse to live under, and why we formed our own country. But Lincoln's response to that is, do I let the majority of the laws go by the wayside in order to honor a couple of laws? Or in this crisis, am I allowed to ignore certain laws for the greater good? And of course, you know, that it's an ends justify the means, and the president's war powers are enormous. Congress is not in session when the war begins. Lincoln calls it back into session for July 4th, which means he's got a free hand to deal with this thing. And he manages through dint of great effort and ruthlessness to keep Maryland in. Kentucky, he takes a handoff stance toward. Kentucky could swing either way. It was a slave state, a southern state, but it was also had northern leanings along the Ohio, and the southern parts of Indiana, Illinois actually had southern leanings because they were connected to the water traffic that went down through New Orleans. It was a very complex situation politically and economically, and Lincoln and Davis both agree, for the time being, hands off on Kentucky. And Kentucky's got to get to remain neutral for many months. It's an awkward position. It's unsustainable in the long run. But for the moment, it's to the benefit of both sides not to antagonize Kentucky. And Lincoln is supposed to have said, "I hope to have God on my side in this struggle, but I absolutely must have Kentucky." Because if Kentucky leaves, then the northern border of the Confederacy is the Ohio River. It's really hard to see the Union prevailing in a contest where that is the case. Missouri is going to be a very different question. Missouri, of course, had been the scene of trouble during the Compromise and the crisis of 1820. Missouri ruffians had crossed the border into Kansas during the period of Bleeding Kansas. Missouri is very badly divided. The people in the southern portion of the state, very pro-Confederate. The people around St. Louis, which includes a large contingent of relatively recent German immigrants, are very pro-Union. Missouri is going to be the scene of true civil war throughout the conflict. Guerrilla bands, pro-Southern, are going to raid through the state, and Union Army contingents are going to try and put them down. There's going to be atrocity and reprisal. Missouri is going to be a convoluted kind of no man's land outside of St. Louis for much of the war, and that begins almost as soon as the guns on Fort Sumter fall silent. Missouri is actually, as is Kentucky, going to have a government body that claims to take it out of the Union. They'll have stars in the Confederate flag, but the reality is that Lincoln is going to hold on to what really matters in Missouri. He's eventually going to prevail in Kentucky as well, as we will see, and he's going to hold Maryland in. And so the battle lines are drawn. Both sides immediately go to the task of raising armies. There is an enormous amount of enthusiasm for that. Young men, North and South, rush to the colors. There don't begin to be enough uniforms, weapons, tents, and other equipment to absorb the enthusiastic volunteers. A good portion of the officer class of the Army and the Navy resign, and they go and offer their services to the Southern Confederacy. And of course, North and South, there aren't nearly enough trained military professionals to take this massive influx of hundreds of thousands of raw recruits and turn them into soldiers. And so it's going to take a long time. It's going to take the better part of a year for the two countries to actually build armies, but the fighting is not going to wait for that. The fighting is going to begin relatively quickly, and initially it's going to focus on the 100 miles between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was the capital of Virginia, but after the secession of Virginia, the Confederates moved their capital to Richmond. And so in late May of 1861, Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the Confederacy. So only 100 miles separates the two capital cities, and that, of course, is going to make Virginia a key battleground. 60% of all Civil War battles are going to be fought in Virginia, and the war is going to be divided up militarily into three geographic regions. There's what is known as the Eastern Theater, which is essentially going to be Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Then there's going to be the Western Theater, which is everything east of the Mississippi and west of the Appalachian Mountains. So Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, eastern Louisiana, and ironically, Florida and North and South Carolina are going to be considered Western Theater as well, because the flow of the armies that wind up fighting there. And then you have the vast Trans-Mississippi region, which is everything west of the Mississippi, so Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and western Louisiana, Texas, the Indian Territory known as Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico are all going to see combat. They're going to be fighting along the coast of Texas, a fair amount of it, and there's going to be fighting in Arizona and New Mexico. Troops from Colorado and California are going to get caught up in that. So really, the battle line is going to stretch for 1,000 miles from Chesapeake Bay all the way to the deserts of Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And of course, there's going to be combat on all the world's oceans. Confederate commerce raiders are going to go out to disrupt Union merchant trade. The U.S. Navy is going to try and chase those commerce raiders down. Lincoln orders a blockade of all southern coastline to strangle the South, which does not have anything like the industry of the North, from receiving the importation of war material and manufactured goods from Europe, or enabling the South to send cotton to European markets. Eventually, the blockade is going to become a very important factor in Northern victory, although in the beginning there were so few Union warships, a few dozen, that it was wildly ineffective. But politically, Lincoln makes a big mistake, diplomatically makes a big mistake by declaring a blockade of the Confederate coastline, because a blockade is something you do to a foreign nation. A country closes its own ports. And so when Lincoln orders a blockade, he is de facto recognizing the existence of the Confederate States of America. Legally, the U.S. will never do that, but de facto it has to do it, because there will be prisoner exchanges and negotiations and all kinds of things where the two governments have to treat each other as existing governments. But from a European perspective, as soon as Lincoln declared a blockade, that meant that the Confederacy, if not a recognized nation, and no country in the world will ever actually recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation, it did mean that the Confederates were legal belligerents. That meant that they were lawfully fighting a war, and therefore all the rules of war applied, and England and France and most of Europe recognized the Confederates as belligerents, and by recognizing them as belligerents, they were able and more than willing to loan them money and to conduct diplomacy with them, to build them warships, to sell them arms, munitions, uniforms, all sorts of things that are going to greatly aid the Confederate cause. And so the battle lines are set, the armies are forming, the navies are building, the contest for the border states is ongoing, and the question now is what happens next? What happens next? What's the strategy going to be? And Jefferson Davis laid out a strategy that was very straightforward and simple. All the South wants is to be left alone. Just want to be left alone. Want to go on about our business. We're not trying to destroy the United States. We're willing to do commerce with the United States. We're willing to give them free transit of the Mississippi River. We just want to be left alone to govern ourselves. And so Davis lays out a defensive strategy, which is good diplomatically. It's politically wise, and it's militarily necessary because he doesn't begin to have enough arms and munitions to equip all of the troops who come in so that they could undertake offensive military actions. So you might as well do this. The Lincoln administration has a harder task. It's going to have to destroy the Confederacy through military means. And Winfield Scott, who's still Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army, although he's very old, his health is poor, he's extremely heavy now, he weighs almost 300 pounds, his body has given out on him. He's not really capable of going into the field in any circumstance, but his brain is still good, and he says, look, what we need to do is we need to blockade the South, we need to take control of the Mississippi River, and then basically leave the South alone, let it wither on the vine. The people down there will get tired of the hardships imposed by naval blockade and the loss of their commerce, and eventually they'll come to their senses and they'll return to the Union. And ultimately the North is going to do something akin to what Scott is talking about, but at the time, that idea was completely unacceptable. And although Lincoln will declare a blockade, Scott's plan, derisively called the Anaconda Plan, because it hearkened to the giant snake that coils around its victim and squeezes them slowly to death. The Anaconda Plan would take years, and nobody believed that that was necessary. In fact, everybody believed that this war is going to be won in one great big battle. Why anybody thought that is hard to fathom, but this was the popular conception. There's going to be one big battle, somebody's going to win it, somebody's going to lose it, and it's going to be over. There's not going to be much bloodshed. One congressman famously promised that he would wipe up with his handkerchief all the blood that would be shed in this war. And of course, he and everyone else has seriously miscalculated. It's not going to take one big battle. It's going to take something like 10,000 battles, big and small. It's going to take 4 years. It's going to take an enormous amount of wealth and resources and an enormous amount of lives before this thing is settled. But now the battle lines have been drawn, sides have been taken, the war is at hand. The arguing, the debating, the compromising is over. The Union has finally come apart. And now, as one Southern politician put it, the God of battles will decide who is right and who is wrong. And so we come to the end of our first lecture on the war between the states, and we will continue to explore the war over the next couple of lectures as we go forward. So now let me ask you our questions, and that question is, who was the candidate of the Southern wing of the Democratic Party in the election of 1860? Who was the candidate of the Southern wing of the Democratic Party in the election of 1860? Question number 2, what was the name of the fort where the Civil War began? What was the name of the fort where the Civil War began? Question number 3, who is the president of the Confederate States of America? Who is the president of the Confederate States of America? Question number 4, true or false, Lincoln gave tentative support to a proposed 13th Amendment that would have guaranteed the existence of slavery in the states where it then was forever. True or false, Lincoln gave tentative support to a proposed 13th Amendment that would have guaranteed the existence of slavery in the states where it then was forever. And then finally, a final question, how many states seceded after Lincoln called for volunteers to put down what he called the rebellion? How many southern states seceded after Lincoln issued a call for volunteers to put down the rebellion? So those questions should be emailed in, or your answers to those questions should be emailed in to me as part of the objective portion of our final test, and as evidence that you've listened to this lecture. And we are through chapter 14, we are into chapter 15, and when we get together next time out, we will fight the first 2 years of the war between the states and see the Confederacy come very close to winning its independence, and Lincoln responding by having to change, or rather add to, the Union's war goals. Emancipation is going to become part of the conflict.